Matthew 20:25. You know that the princes of the Gentiles rule over them. It is first said that Christ called them to him, that he might reprove them in private, and next we learn from it that, being ashamed of their ambition, they did not openly complain, but that a sort of hollow murmur arose, and everyone secretly preferred himself to the rest. He does not explain generally how deadly a plague ambition is, but simply warns them that nothing is more foolish than to fight about nothing. He shows that the primacy, which was the occasion of dispute among them, has no existence in his kingdom. Those persons, therefore, who extend this saying indiscriminately to all the godly are mistaken, for Christ only takes occasion from the present occurrence to show that it is absurd in the apostles to dispute about the degree of power and honor in their own rank, because the office of teaching, to which they were appointed, has no resemblance to the governments of the world. I do acknowledge that this doctrine applies both to private persons and to kings and magistrates, for no man deserves to be reckoned one of Christ's flock, unless he has made such proficiency under the teacher of humility, as to claim nothing for himself, but condescend to cultivate brotherly love. This is, no doubt, true, but the design of Christ was, as I have said, to distinguish between the spiritual government of his church and the empires of the world, that the apostles might not look for the favors of a court, for in proportion as any of the nobles is loved by kings, he rises to wealth and distinction. But Christ appoints pastors of his church, not to rule, but to serve. This reflects the error of the Anabaptists, who exclude kings and magistrates from the Church of God, because Christ declares that they are not like his disciples, though the comparison is here made not between Christians and ungodly men, but between the nature of their offices. Besides, Christ did not look so much at the persons of men as at the condition of his church. For it was possible that one who was governor of a village or of a city might, in a case of urgent necessity, discharge also the office of teaching, but Christ satisfied himself with explaining what belongs to the apostolic office and what is at variance with it. But a question arises, why does Christ, who appointed separate orders in his church, disown in this passage all degrees? For he appears to throw them all down, or, at least, to place them on a level, so that not one rises above the rest. But natural reason prescribes a very different method, and Paul, when describing the government of the church, Ephesians 4:11, enumerates the various departments of the ministry, in such a manner as to make the rank of apostleship higher than the office of pastors. Timothy and Titus also, are unquestionably enjoined by him to exercise authoritative superintendence over others, according to the command of God. I reply, if we carefully examine the whole, it will be found that even kings do not rule justly or lawfully, unless they serve, but that the apostolic office differs from earthly government in this respect, that the manner in which kings and magistrates serve does not prevent them from governing, or indeed from rising above their subjects in magnificent pomp and splendor. Thus David, Hezekiah, and others of the same class, while they were the willing servants of all, used a scepter, a crown, a throne, and other emblems of royalty. But the government of the church admits nothing of this sort, for Christ allowed the pastors nothing more than to be ministers, and to abstain entirely from the exercise of authority. Here, too, it ought to be observed, that the discourse relates to the thing itself rather than to the disposition. Christ distinguishes between the apostles and the rank of kings, not because kings have a right to act haughtily, but because the station of royalty is different from the apostolic office. While, therefore, both ought to be humble, it is the duty of the apostles always to consider what form of government the Lord has appointed for his church. As to the words which Matthew employs, the princes of the Gentiles rule over them, Luke conveys the same import by saying, they are called benefactors, which means, that kings possess great wealth and abundance, in order that they may be generous and bountiful. For though kings have greater delight in their power, and a stronger desire that it should be formidable, than that it should be founded in the consent of the people, still they desire the praise of munificence. Hence, too, they take the name in the Hebrew language, divim, Netibim, they are so called from bestowing gifts, for taxes and tributes are paid to them for no other purpose than to furnish the expense necessary to the magnificence of their rank. Matthew 20:26. It shall not be so among you. There can be no doubt that Christ refers to the foolish imagination by which he saw that the apostles were deceived. It is foolish and improper in you, he says, to imagine a kingdom which is unsuitable to me, and therefore, if you desire to serve me faithfully, you must resort to a different method, which is, that each of you may strive to serve others. But whoever wishes to be great among you, let him be your servant. These words are employed in an unusual sense, for ambition does not allow a man to be devoted, or, rather, to be subject to his brethren. Abject flattery, I do acknowledge, is practiced by those who aspire to honors, but nothing is farther from their intention than to serve. But Christ's meaning is not difficult to be perceived. As every man is carried away by a love of himself, he declares that this passion ought to be directed to a different object. Let the only greatness, eminence, and rank, which you desire, be, to submit to your brethren, and let this be your primacy, to be the servants of all. Matthew 20:28. As the Son of Man, Christ confirms the preceding doctrine by his own example, for he voluntarily took upon himself the form of a servant, and emptied himself, as Paul also informs us, Philippians 2-7. To prove more clearly how far he was from indulging in lofty views, he reminds them of his death. Because I have chosen you to the honor of being near me, you are seized by a wicked ambition to reign. But I, by whose example you ought to regulate your life, came not to exalt myself, or to claim any royal dignity. On the contrary, I took upon me, along with the mean and despised form of the flesh, the ignominy of the cross. If it be objected, that Christ was exalted by the Father, in order that every knee might bow to him, Philippians 2-9-10. It is easy to reply, that what he now says refers to the period of his humiliation. Accordingly, Luke adds, that he lived among them, as if he were a servant, not that in appearance, or in name, or in reality, he was inferior to them, for he always wished to be acknowledged as their Master and Lord, but because from the heavenly glory he descended to such meekness, that he submitted to bear their infirmities. Besides, it ought to be remembered that a comparison is here made between the greater and the less, as in that passage. If I, who am your Master and Lord, have washed your feet, much more ought you to perform this service to one another. John 13:14. And to give his life a ransom for many. Christ mentioned his death, as we have said, in order to withdraw his disciples from the foolish imagination of an earthly kingdom. But it is a just and appropriate statement of its power and results, when he declares that his life is the price of our redemption, whence it follows, that we obtain an undeserved reconciliation with God, the price of which is to be found nowhere else than in the death of Christ. Wherefore, this single word overturns all the idle talk of the papists about their abominable satisfactions again. While Christ has purchased us by his death to be his property, this submission, of which he speaks, is so far from diminishing his boundless glory, that it greatly increases its splendor. The word many, Pauline, is not put definitely for a fixed number, but for a large number, for he contrasts himself with all others. And in this sense it is used in Romans 5:15, where Paul does not speak of any part of men, but embraces the whole human race.